It's good to see you all. Looks like you're all ready to go. Good. I'd like to get started on today's topic. Today we'll be discussing fairy tales. Let me start off with a definition so we have a clear idea of what we mean by fairy tales. Things happen in fairy tales that cannot happen in ordinary life. Let me give you a few examples. A boy becomes a bird. A princess sleeps for 100 years. Mirrors talk. A pumpkin turns into a carriage. Let's dive in and focus today on the purpose of fairy tales and answer this question. Why were fairy tales created? Let's start looking at the audience. Who were fairy tales written for? Some people assume that fairy tales were created for children, but this, in fact, is absolutely not the case. From the very beginning, 1,000 years ago, fairy tales were stories that adults told other adults. But why did they start telling stories? What was the purpose of fairy tales? We will look at three general, different ideas about the purposes that fairy tales serve. The first idea is that fairy tales cause a sense of wonder in the reader or listener. Let me explain. Wonder is an emotion that we feel when we are excited at the idea that something new and unexpected or unexplainable is about to happen. It is this sense of wonder, this sense of strange and wonderful things that are happening, that some scholars believe is the reason why fairy tales exist. They help people wonder about the workings of the universe where anything can happen at any time. In fact, all kinds of strange things happen in fairy tales. Let me explain how this works. If we can imagine that anything can happen to the characters in fairy tales, then we might also believe that these things can happen in our own lives. That life can change, that problems can go away, people can find answers. You see, fairy tales help make us hopeful. They make us believe that life really can get better. Isn't this a wonderful explanation? Let's move on and look at another possible purpose of fairy tales. And that is entertainment. People didn't have TVs or radios or even theatre in most places. So what did they do? They played music. They talked. They told each other stories. Scholars support this idea by pointing out that fairy tales became very popular in Europe and America during the late 1800s. And oh, by the way, I will include some dates on the quiz, so you should probably include them in your notes. Where was I? Oh, the late 1800s. At that point in history, daily life and work was extremely routine and boring. Take, for example, factory work or being a worker on a farm. This kind of work can be very hard on the body and mind and leave little time for daydreaming and leisure and imagination. So fairy tales helped people escape from the routine in their lives. I want to discuss one more idea about the purpose of fairy tales. Some say that fairy tales serve the purpose of civilizing people. Now, what do I mean by civilizing? Civilizing really means educating people about good behavior. Let's look at how this works. Think of the plots in fairy tales, the events in each story. These events teach us things. They teach readers important values of life and society. Values like hard work, honesty, and goodness. This is a really good way to teach people how to be good citizens. There are always clear consequences in these fairy tales. For example, people get punished for not obeying their parents, so we learn to obey our parents. Most fairy tales show characters getting rewards when they change their behavior and follow the rules of the family or society. When you take a step back, you really see that these stories that you think of as simple and childlike really are not so simple. In fact, they're very deep. Fairy tales are stories about who we are and what we believe in. They may come in the form of entertainment, easy to understand and tales of wonder, but they're actually quite powerful. Let me wrap up with this thought. If you ever doubt the power of fairy tales, think for a minute of how many you still remember. That's it for today. Bye-bye.